Welcome back to Nifty 50 Photographers. Now in today's video we're going to look at how you can develop your own style of photos so that when people look at them they'll instantly recognize them as yours. And I'm talking about fine art photography, and I'm really talking about a color profile that you're going to add to your photos to give them a consistency of look. I'm going to do that using the Adobe color manipulation tools. If you haven't watched my video from last week about color and fine art photography, highly recommend you do that, and I'll leave a link to that up here. Let's just do a very quick recap. So the first thing you need to think about is calibration. And I'm not going to explain it because I've put all that in the other video, but if you adjust things like the hue in the calibration, so let's adjust the hue of the red on this image of a color wheel, you can see it's affecting all the other colors too, not only the reds. The same is true of green, and the same is true of blue. If we look at saturation, you'll see as I move the slider into the more intense side that all the colors get more intense, not just the reds, for example. And as I take it the other way, they all become a bit desaturated. The same is true of greens, and the same is true of blue. So that's how the calibration tool works. It's a global color changing tool. We need to understand the other color manipulation tools in Lightroom to be able to develop our own style. So let's look at now hue, saturation and luminance. So if I play with the red hue, for example, you'll see now that it's only affecting the red section of the color wheel. It's not affecting the greens and blues. The same is true now if I play with the greens or the blues, it will only affect that section of the color wheel. Now let's look at saturation. So what does that do? So if I slide the saturation slider over to the right, it'll make the colors more saturated, more dense, give them more intensity if you like. You've noticed it more actually when you take it the other way, because you take out the color. So in the reds, you'll see the red section of the color wheel start to go gray. I can do the same thing to show you with the greens and the blues. Now finally, let's look at luminance. Now luminance is slightly different from saturation. Although it's going to make the colors brighter, it's also going to shift their color a bit. It's almost going to shift their hue, if you like. It's a bit confusing when you compare it with the hue tool, but let me show you. So if you slide it to the right, what you'll see is the colors become denser and more intense. If I slide it to the left, they become darker. They've still got that red color behind them, so they still appear a shade of red. They haven't gone gray, which is what happens when you slide the saturation slider to the left. So that's the difference between the three tools. Now there's one other area of your image which is related to color grading, and that's these color grading wheels. Now they're split up into three sections: highlights, shadows and midtones. And the midtones is the one that's going to have the biggest effect, because if your image is correctly exposed, those are where most of the image will be. And we get the same kind of thing. So this works by, you can click on an individual wheel, and you've then got a slider. So you've got a little circle that starts in the center. You can drag that to the circumference, to the outer edge, and you can move it also round the wheel. So let's start with the blues. So drag it towards the edge. It'll make the blues in the midtones more intense. And the same is true of the reds and of the greens. Now if we do that also with the shadows, and we can do it also with the highlights, and we get the same effect. So those are the three manipulation tools. So let's see how we put them into practice. So I've got a lovely autumn scene here taken on Rydal Water in the Lake District, and it's getting towards duskish, and it's got some lovely colours in it, some reds, greens and blues. So we're going to manipulate that and apply my style to it. So the first thing I'm going to do is apply a colour profile to it, and it normally would default to Adobe Color. If you click on that, it bring up all the options, and you can shortcut it a bit if you like. If you just want to see the color ones, click on color. If you just want to see black and white, click on black and white. I'm going to click on color, and I'm going to choose some of the artistic ones. You've got a whole host of choices in there, such as camera matching, the Adobe ones for portrait, landscape and so on. But I'm going to choose the artistic ones, and I'm going to go for artistic 4 because that's one that I like, that fits my style, if you like. So we'll close that. Just before we close that, you can alter the amount of profile that's applied, so you can just do it very subtly, or you could overboost it and put 200% on if you like, and you can see that's really made this image quite yellow and blue, and that's too much for me, so I'm going to leave it close to 100. That'll do for now. Right, now I should say I've done some very basic development already on this just to speed up the process, but literally all I've done is sort out the exposure bit, add a bit of extra contrast. But let's now look at applying the color style that I want. So I'm going to go down to the calibration tool first of all. Now my goal here is to get a slightly teal and orange feel to the photo because they're two colors that work very well. You'll have seen that from last week's video. So to make this more orange, I might need to play with the reds. Just before I do that, there is an option up here to change the tint of the shadows. And I'm going to make that slightly more red because there are some trees that have lost their leaves and they've gone sort of greyish colour. I just want to put a bit of magenta into them and make them look a bit more interesting. So I'm going to tweak that up a little bit, and you see that's affecting this tree line here. Now I'm going to go on to the primary colours. I'm going to play with the hue of the red. Now I want it probably to be a bit more orange in nature, so I'm going to shove that up a little bit, and I'm going to also adjust the saturation of it because I want it to be a bit more intense. Then I'm going to move on to the greens. Now I want to make the trees here, particularly the conifers that keep their leaves all year, I want them to be a deeper green, so I've got some nice contrast with the yellows, and I might increase the saturation of those just a slight amount as well. And then finally I'm going to the blues. Now the blues I'm going to go the other way because I want this teal look rather than intense blue. That's really what I mean when I play with the slider. If I take it over to the right, actually now making everything look magenta, which is wrong, so I want to go the other way and give it a slightly more turquoise or teal sort of colour. So I'll take that down and I've increased the saturation of that slightly too. So now I can go back and play with the hue, saturation and luminance sliders. And let's start with hue. And the colours I'm interested in bringing out are things like the reds and oranges and yellows. So let's just have a little play with those. Now I quite like to do this using this little adjustment tool. So I can drag that onto the image, and then you can just move your mouse up and down and you'll see it's affecting the sliders of the color that you've got your little pointer on. So I can play with the oranges and yellows. If I bring it down here, you see on these reeds I can make them either very light or more orangey browny color, so I'm going to bring them down. And in the blues up here I want to try and get a bit more intensity there. Okay, so I'm happy with that in terms of hue. Now I can play with the saturation. I want to saturate the blue a little bit more, and maybe the greens. And these adjustments are all localized to that color group. It's not affecting the whole color wheel. And finally the luminance. And really I want to bring the luminance down of the sky. And that's given me a sort of basic image now that I'm quite happy with the sort of colors. It's got a slightly orange and teal feel to it. So now I can move on to the color grading. Now the way I like to do this is start with the midtones wheel. And very crudely, if you want to see what it does, get a hold of the little circle in the middle, drag it out as far as you like really, but the more you drag it out, the more extreme the effect will be. So maybe take it to the middle and just walk round the circle, and you'll see the effect it has on your image. And if you see a particular color that you're happy with, then you can fine tune it from there. Now with the midtones, I'm wanting to get an overall slightly orange feel to my image, so I'm going to start in this orange area between the sort of yellows and greens and the orange, and just fine tune it around there somewhere, and then slide it in and out and see how intense I want to make that. And when I've got where I want, I'll move on to do the shadows and the highlights in exactly the same way. So let's look at the shadows. Probably want to make them a little bit deeper green, just to give some contrast against the yellows. But I'm going to do it quite a yellowish green. And then finally, let's look at the highlights. And the highlights, I'm probably going to go into the blue. Now that might surprise you, highlights are usually sunlight, orange and yellow, but to bring up that sort of teal effect, which is reflected in the water as well as the sky. So there we go, that's kind of what I'm happy with. Let me show you what would happen if I'd done it in the yellows. You see it's now just affecting more the foreground, the trees and the reeds. So I'm going to go back to where I was. And that's my basic color grading done. Now you might want to go through them all now and fine tune it all a little bit. Go back to your calibration, play with that, and play with these other sliders, and you can actually fine tune and get exactly the style that you're really happy with. So as we've gone through this journey, I hope you've begun to realize really that the kind of bedrock of this is the calibration tool. So this is how your camera is interpreting red, green and blue, and it's your twist on that interpretation that the calibration tool and how you manipulate it, that's what you're going to produce, your twist on it, if you like, your particular style. And then you can fine tune individual areas of the color wheel with the hue, saturation and luminance sliders, and then finally apply that kind of cinematic effect by playing with the shadows, the midtones and the highlights. And you should then, the more you practice this, you'll get into the habit of creating something that you find suits your style and that people start to recognize you from. So I hope you've enjoyed that video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments if there's anything that you'd like more videos on or more understanding of. In the meantime, go out and have some fun with your photography. Go out and practice. It's coming up autumn now, so some great chance to play with some lovely color images. And I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.